This week, we welcome journalist and author Steve Krakauer.
It's one thing to get these stories wrong, as so many in the press did, and have a total lack of curiosity in the moment about it. But to go and support the censorship under the guise of stopping misinformation and disinformation, I just think is so catastrophic to the principles of what journalism and media is supposed to be about: First Amendment and free speech and the free flow of ideas. I mean, I'm almost a free speech absolutist myself. I would say, all speech, unless it's direct calls to violence against a person or an individual. But the reason that I support free speech and I spoke out when people like Louis Farrakhan gets suspended on Twitter, who I don't think I could, dislike the points of view of anyone more, is because you need to get these points of view out there so they can be debated and discussed and dismissed. If you lock it down, that's when these things grow and metastasize. And I don't think the press gets it in their current form, which is shocking.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join PHETASY.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at PHETASY.com. All righty. I'm with Steve Krakauer, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bridget.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you and see you, and a man of the media yourself. You wrote a book, Uncovered, about the media.
Yes.
And how it lost the people and got in bed with power. And it's really, I think this book is so important for this moment right now.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's something that has been on my mind for a while. I was in the media myself. I was in the corporate media. We can go through kind of my background, but I worked at places like NBC and Fox News, and was at CNN for many years, about three or 4 years, and generally had good experiences there. I have to say. I mean, I think that there was valid criticisms of CNN when I was there. I write about it in the book a little bit, but overall, I think the heart was in the right place. They tried to get it right, didn't always do it. Sometimes their bias is shown through. And then I moved out. I've been in Dallas now for about 9 years, and I'm physically outside of that corporate media bubble, but also really just witnessed from the outside something fundamental changing in just the last, let's say, 7 years. I mean, I start the book in 2014, but I think certainly 2015, and Donald Trump played a huge factor in it. Something really changed, and a lot of a lot of things changed. And so I tried to track that in the book. It actually, in a lot of ways, started as this 3-page proposal that I wrote up in April of 2017 as the media missed Trump, and here's how you can kind of fix your blind spots and reconnect with the audience. And I called in all my favors, and I went to New York, and I met with executives at CNN and ABC and NBC and CBS, and kind of pitched them on this idea. And there was a little bit of interest, but ultimately everyone passed. And I kind of sat on this, and I turned it into my newsletter, which is Fourth Watch, which I write about on a weekly basis, and then ultimately turned it into Uncovered, which really tracks the last 7 years of what went wrong.
It's fascinating because I'm a product of the last 7 years. So I stumbled. I always joke that I got caught in the crossfire of the culture war, but my own, I hate, for lack of a better word, journey in media has tracked through really the last 7-8 years. And I think that I wouldn't exist in a previous media ecosystem. It was it's just completely, I occupy the weird kind of center space that everybody hates. And right. I mean, I understand the criticisms. And I don't know that the fact that I even have a platform and a voice and came up in this weird time, it's just, there's so many independent voices who exist that just kind of wouldn't otherwise, I think, prior to 2013, 2014.
Absolutely. I think there was a couple things at play that led to it. I think certainly just the technology changed, social
Right.
media, the rise, and there's lots of negative things about Twitter and social media, which you can definitely get into, which I write about and uncover. But there are positives also, because the barrier to entry is so much lower now. People can build platforms on places like YouTube and Substack and podcasts and on all of these different platforms. And so the technology changes, which is great. But also, into the void of this mess that the corporate media, the structure, the institutional press had before, when they had real power and influence, and they still do to some extent, but they've lost that. And into that void, there's been new voices that have come in. I mean, I write about Joe Rogan in the book because he's just sort of the biggest example of this, as someone who just kind of was doing his thing and continues doing his thing. And then he rose to massive prominence. It's like, why does CNN and the New York Times, why do they hate Joe Rogan so much? Like, and you really step back and you think about it, it's because he's impeding on their power and influence, and he's doing so not aggressively and trying to take their space, but by just being a guy who's interested and curious and asking interesting questions and having conversations. So yeah, I think it's opened a lot of areas. I too, like you, think of myself as an independent, in a lot of ways, sort of politically homeless, also moderate in many ways, and I do think that there are areas for that now that maybe there weren't before, because of just the massive. The way that the corporate structure has ceded ground, and areas they could have continued that power, but instead they for a lot of reasons went the other direction, and it's great for opportunities for outside voices.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much. You open your book with the laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop story. It was this moment, and you also talk about Ferguson and what you're tracking too. In my experience, COVID comes up in your book. I've been collecting all these letters from the politically homeless, and you're basically talking about all of these, for lack of a better word, I don't think it's red pilling, but there are these red pill moments for people. I guess it is red pilling if you go by like Michael Malice's definition of red pill, which is you wake up to the fact that the corporate media is kind of lying to you, and you see that everything you believed before that was also probably a lie, and you are seeing more behind the curtain. So you really do a great job of tracking these moments that I think people really can, like myself, can relate to it on a visceral level, where there were these moments where I was like, oh, that whole thing with Ferguson was such a moment where you're so right. People still believe the lies about that whole entire, even though the Obama administration came out, people still believe the lies about that God, what is that quote? The lie spreads fast, the lie spreads around the world before the truth gets out of bed, or something like that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That was such a big example for me. And really in going back and trying to track, where did this start? Because it did. Look, I spent a lot of time on Trump in the book, and Trump is certainly a factor in, but I think he exacerbated some of these problems that already existed. And I do think 2014, Ferguson felt that this really pivotal moment for a lot of reasons. And it's why, as you mentioned, I start chapter 1 talking about it, because what do the average person who's watching or listening to this right now think about when you think of Ferguson, Missouri? You probably think of hands up, don't shoot. And that's what Michael Brown said to Darren Wilson before he was shot and killed. That's just what became the talking point. That's what was reported that happened. And then, a year later, the Obama Justice Department, still going on in 2015, after an extensive interview process and extensive reporting on it, they found that was never said. Every witness says that those words were never uttered. In fact, he charged at Darren Wilson, the police officer, and it was a justified shooting in the end. I mean, it was a horrible situation, but it was a justified shooting in the end. And not only that, but they went and looked at Darren Wilson's background and found absolutely no racial animus there at all. And so that was one point. And then as I continue on, they actually, though, found that lots of other forces within the Ferguson Police Department really were sort of racist. And actually that Darren Wilson may have been, instead of being the bad apple, he was one of the good ones in a lot of ways. And there were lots of officers. I mean, there were stats that the Obama Justice Department uncovered that said that every stop that was for resisting arrest, every arrest that was for, essentially resisting arrest, was a Black person. That seems a little bit far-fetched. And it goes on like this. And so at the same time, you have all of this misreporting that happened with it, not a lot of correction of it. And then you also have media entities like a CNN that started to report things like, well, it's not really important whether it was ever said, hands up, don't shoot. It became more about the symbolism of it and how it started this movement. It's like, well, that's the narrative of it. That's not journalism. That's maybe activism, and that's for other occupations. But when suddenly you care more about the movement it starts rather than getting the story right, that's when mistakes can get made. And that's also when the incentives change, right? Why does this happen? Well, a lot of it is social media and pressure that comes from it. And why would you wait to get the story right if you're going to get yelled at, if you're not automatically saying, oh no, this was a racist police officer who shot someone who said, hands up, don't shoot. No, you might as well just report that and move on and see what happens later. So yeah, I think that's where a lot of these bad habits really started. And then of course they got worse throughout the Trump administration. And then even worse, I think, and more in the, suppression and censorship phase when it came to COVID.
Yeah. I actually remember my moment of thinking that this was not good was when Ashton Kutcher was competing with CNN for followers on Twitter. I was sick in bed and I had just stumbled on Twitter and didn't fully understand how to use it. And it was this big thing that was happening on Twitter and I was just watching it. And I said to my cousin, this is really bad. If you have or maybe it's good. Some people might argue it's good, but it seemed like having one person, this is why I think Donald Trump really capitalized on this ground that was laid when Ashton Kutcher was competing with CNN for followers. I said, when you have an entire news organization competing with a single individual for followers, how it will only take one individual with more followers to be able to compete with the news,
right?
Which we saw.
yeah.
And I don't think, and drive news cycles. I think that Trump is brilliant at manipulating media and making the story about him, whether that's just a, byproduct of his own narcissism. I've always said about Trump, imagine having actual clinical narcissism, which I'm not going to diagnose him with. I'm not some kind of psychologist, but let's just imagine
it's fair. Yeah.
And you think the world revolves around you, and then it does.
Right.
You weren't wrong,
Yeah, no, exactly. This is someone who, first of all, I read The Art of the Deal during the last, when he was running for president in 2015, which, he wrote this in 1987. It was a big bestseller, but it really, I wish so many people in the corporate media had read it, because I think you could see the playbook. It didn't change.
Right.
In decades. It hadn't really changed. The medium changed. But he's sitting there describing how he had this real estate project that was on hold and they couldn't do anything with it, but he had investors coming. And so instead of just telling the truth, he just had the construction equipment, the dump trucks and everything. He's like, just move some dirt from one place to the other, make it look like you're working. And he was able to make it seem like it was an active site, and then got the investment and then got the positive media. I mean, he was brilliant about it. And the whole playbook was there decades earlier. And now he's got this medium to do it. And it also really shows, because obviously he was able to harness the power of Twitter in the way that the Ashton Kutchers did before. But it also says a lot about Twitter itself, because this is a medium that, so few Americans actually spend a lot of time on.
Right.
I think the latest stat is that about 2% of all American adults account for approximately 90% of the tweets when it comes to news and politics.
Right.
So it's a very minor number of actual people. At the same time, as someone who spends way too much time on Twitter, I love Twitter, and I hate that I love Twitter, but I do.
Yep. I get it.
unless you are like, you have to be really self-aware about it, because if you have something you put out there and it gets a couple hundred, couple thousand retweets, it can feel like a huge, like a drug. I mean, it's like, this is extremely exciting. And it might be, it seems like you're on top of the world. And if you get 50 people, 100 people yelling at you about a tweet, it can feel like you're the star in a negative way of Twitter that day. And really it can, those are the sort of things that can make you change what you do. And it has. I mean, I talked to someone in the book who's the founder of a media property who describes her own reporters changing the way they cover a story, or maybe not covering a story at all, for the fear of how it might be reacted to on Twitter. I mean, that's a huge problem, but that's what the medium can do now, and it's something that is plays such a role in journalism.
Yeah, there's so much here. That to me really points to something I've talked to Glenn Greenwald about on this podcast, and audience capture. And what's been so fascinating to me is that you generally talk about this in relation to independent individuals. But even with the recent Fox Dominion lawsuit, you're seeing that this is happening to these giant, corporate media. They're entirely like, well, we don't want to upset our audience, or we have to kind of tell our audience what they want to hear. And my husband and I were talking about this because the CNN that I remember was pretty straight news, and yeah. I'm sure it was biased, but like you said, I felt like it did a pretty good job about. I thought it was just report. I felt like it was always the middle one of the kind of of the corporate press. It always felt like the most centered, and I think they too got captured by their audience, or maybe just America as it became more polarized. These places became more transparently partisan.
Yeah, it's a tough one with CNN. I think of it like, because I think you're right. When I was at CNN, I always used to laugh. I would go down to Atlanta a lot every couple months, because that was where their main headquarters was at the time. Not anymore. Now it's basically New York and DC. And in the Atlanta, the CNN Center, it's basically a mall attached to the CNN bureau. There was a CNN store, and you could buy the CNN hats and the shirts, and here's Ali Velshi as a and no one really was ever in there. I'd always think like CNN is not really I can see maybe wanting to, in the 10 years ago, wanting to buy an MSNBC hat if you loved MSNBC, or a Fox News hat if you love Fox News. But CNN, you're just like, you're not really a fan of CNN. CNN's just like the news, it's almost by design. It's sort of boring old CNN. And I can also say that, when I was there, especially like during 2012, I was there at every debate that CNN had. I was there at every election night. A lot of times I was in those rooms with the top executives. There was a real sense of not wanting to put your thumb on the scale and move towards Obama over Romney, really wanting to appear fair and to actually be fair to both sides. That was an actual mission of CNN. They didn't always succeed, but I think that was definitely what they wanted to do, at least for the more people in there. And so then what changed? And I do think that in some ways it was the business itself. It's why I spend time on ESPN and the New York Times and CNN and these outlets that you would think like there was maybe great years for ESPN and there was a little less good years, but they just printed money. I mean, just over and over. Like they were untouchable. And then the business model changes and the audience habits change. And then it started to be like, whoa, wait a second. We're feeling this quicksand for the first time in all time. And then you want to try to grab onto the lowest hanging fruit and make sure that you're safe there. So I think there was some of that, but then I do think some of it was unique to Trump. If it was a different Republican candidate, would it have gone off the rails as much as it did? I'm not so sure. I think that he was great for business, as we talked about, but it was also personal. Jeff Zucker was the guy who was, made at NBC thanks to The Apprentice and Donald Trump. Right. He was at Donald Trump's wedding, along with people like Gayle King and Katie Couric and Chris Matthews.
Right.
Donald Trump was in that world, and then he became this turncoat. And so you put a lot of these factors together, and it was this perfect storm. And I think there were also people that I talked to in newsrooms from CNN and beyond that believed that Donald Trump was this existential threat to democracy. They really believed they were like doing Watergate every day. And, I don't think that was true, but I would say to them, if you really believe this, that's when you need to double down on your principles and your standards even more. That's when you really want to prove it to his audience, to his fans, then they need to trust you. but they went the other direction. It was instead of two sources, now let's get one. Maybe, the New York Times has heard from someone who talked to Mueller, and let's just run with that for 24 hours. And it was just the guardrails were off, and then they lose the trust of the audience too.
Yeah, I mean, that was like the Avenatti during Kavanaugh with the gangbang. I was like, what? You guys expect anyone to take this seriously? This is just ridiculous now. Yeah, there's a term. I made up this word journalism for this kind of journalism. That's activism disguised as journalism.
Totally.
And it is, boy, did that become transparent in COVID, which I think was another huge just wake up call for so many people who it was the going from lockdown to mostly peaceful protests. It just broke people's brains. I get emails and they're like, I couldn't say goodbye to my grandmother who is dying. And then now we have epidemiologists who are out on CNN saying racism is the real virus and protesting with these images of literally thousands of people in the streets. And I don't know that the generation that lived through that will ever trust the media again.
No.
Like you say in the beginning of your book, that it's basically none. They don't trust anybody.
Yeah. Political independence, people that registered independence are oftentimes citing none as the source that they trust the most, which, that's alarming. And I think independence actually in general, that line, the decline there has been the most severe and the most telling, and should be the most concerning for the average American. Yeah. I think COVID was a huge one. You're talking about like red pill moments. It really wasn't political. It wasn't necessarily people turning to the Republican Party, but it was people wondering what is going on here. What is the hypocrisy that we're seeing? And I talk about it like as this in the book as this concept of like a hypocritical corrective. I don't want the media to be going into the beaches in Florida and yelling at the people for not masking and social distancing. Just like I don't want them to be going and yelling at those people in the social justice protests to be masking and social distancing. But when you do one and not the other, even though it's correcting in the right way scientifically, it's very obvious the hypocrisy there. And they didn't see it. And you would think like on one level, really when the pandemic started, I remember March 2020, April 2020, thinking, this is it. This is the chance where the media was terrible during the Trump years, but this is too important. That was kind of fun and light in some ways. And I get, there were things that happened, but this one actually affects everyone's lives. This one is where you need to be curious, not jump to conclusions. Let's hear from a lot of different voices. Let's try to, we're going to make mistakes. We're sorry we made these mistakes. We'll correct them. I get it. No, this is a once in a generation situation here. You're going to make mistakes. I understand that, but that it went completely opposite direction. And actually, I think what was far worse was the suppression and what I call like anti-speech activism that we saw from it. It was, Nate Silver, who I quote in the book, related to the lab leak theory, just one of the COVID stories that I write about. But this really could work for so many different COVID stories and so many other stories. He said that when you have a topic and there's 2 points of view on it, and there's experts on both sides, and there's evidence on both sides, but only one side is concerned with policing the discourse. One side is saying, well, we can't even hear from the other side. They're dangerous. That's the side you need to be suspicious of. And that's the side that's likely to be wrong also. And I mean, we saw that over and over again. And that's even if that side turned out to be right, about the lab leak theory, about lockdowns, about masks, vaccines, even if they turned out to be right, I still think it was way overreach when it came to locking down and censoring and misinformation, all that. But then they turned out to be wrong in so many of these cases. And that's a real eye opener for the average American and the average viewer.
Yeah. Or things that were common sense and going around, they were looked down on and censored. And, you couldn't talk about how important vitamin D was and these things that exercise, nobody, the lack of curiosity that the press has and this is what I love about your book, is they've abandoned their role. They were supposed to be the people that are questioning pharmaceutical companies, are questioning. It was always so mind bending, seeing CNN during COVID, and then it'd be like, going after Rogan, especially during that. And then it'd be like sponsored by Pfizer. You're like, I'm supposed to trust you guys. Like, there's literally a huge sponsored by Pfizer right after you guys are going after the guy who's like curiously poking holes in some of this stuff. Yeah. And I'm supposed to believe you.
If there was any level of introspection among the media, this would be one of the biggest stories is going back and seeing how we were spun. I think that, I talked to Josh Rogan of the Washington Post in the book, who's a great reporter. And, he describes it a lot as, the mainstream reporters were relying on the science reporters, and the science reporters were relying on their experts that they trusted, the Faucis of the world and the Collins of the world. And they were spun. I mean, they were completely, being fed this propaganda. At the very least, it was wrong information. And then they reported it out, and they were told that, if you have to, make sure your audience believes this, or it's going to be dangerous and they're going to be killing people. And so that's how they did it. But you would think they'd go back and do it. The other day, I just resurfaced this clip of Dana Bash really giving a pretty tough interview to Dr. Fauci in December of 2020. And it was about the vaccines. And he was quoted as saying that it would take 65 to 70% of vaccine or natural immunity to get to herd immunity and to have COVID disappear. And then he later said, well, there's actually a lot of people that seem to be interested in taking the vaccine. So actually, we're going to say 75 to 80% is what it's going to be. And she was really pushing him. Well, now you're just going to move the goalposts here? And he was saying, look, it's just a guesstimate. COVID, we're seeing with the vaccine, it's 94% effective. And so, so the herd immunity, it's going to take 75, 80. I mean, we're way past 75, 80. I mean, all of that was BS. None of that turned out to be true. 94% effective and 75 to 80%. I mean, none of it was true. And there has been no reckoning about it. And again, I mean, I think it's one thing to get these stories wrong, as so many in the press did, and have a total lack of curiosity in the moment about it. But to go and support the censorship under the guise of stopping misinformation and disinformation, I just think is so catastrophic to the principles of what journalism and media is supposed to be about: First Amendment and free speech and the free flow of ideas. I mean, I'm almost a free speech absolutist myself. I would say, all speech, unless it's direct calls to violence against a person or an individual. But the reason that I support free speech, and I spoke out when people like Louis Farrakhan gets suspended on Twitter, who I don't think I could, dislike the points of view of anyone more, is because you need to get these points of view out there so they can be debated and discussed and dismissed. If you lock it down, that's when these things grow and metastasize. And I don't think the press gets it in their current form, which is shocking.
Yeah, there seems to be just a complete lack of self-awareness. And you would think that after Trump, there's been so many opportunities, and then it makes me cynical. Now I find the hardest thing about being red-pilled or awake to just how dishonest the media is or spins things, particularly a lot of the bigger places that you see, is now when something tragic happens, you're not even really allowed to feel that empathy for very long before you go into like defensive mode, because that now, even right now as we're speaking, there is what would be called probably an insurrection, or there's a protest of the Tennessee Capitol.
Right.
And I don't know if it'll be called an insurrection. I don't know what it will be called. And that's because I don't know how it's going to be spun. There's just no consistency. And it leaves people, I think independents in particular, feeling really, for lack of a better word, just cynical. And that is not a great place to be.
Yeah.
I think people generally want to feel hopeful, but I think mostly they feel, and I hear this again about both sides, just both the main voices for the two parties, for example, they will say they're just overhearing all of their BS.
Yeah. I think it's so, we're so quick now I interact with enough people here in Dallas, and that are almost exclusively people that are not like in the business. They're not people in media. They're not people in politics. They don't spend a lot of their time thinking about politics as like a hobby. They don't spend time on Twitter. They're just sort of go about living their lives. I don't think it's really as pervasive as it seems when we talk about like the press themselves, which there are the small bubble of people that spend time on Twitter, the people that are, in the Acela media bubble in New York and DC, other pockets, the San Franciscos and the LAs of the world. I think that there are, and beyond. I mean, I see some of my friends on Facebook, and I'm just shocked that, like, come on, that's really, this is the meme you're going to share, and okay,
okay.
or Instagram. There is definitely some people, but I don't think it's as pervasive as it's made out to be, because I think that most people don't operate under that way. Like, most people can step back and say, January 6th, very bad riot, that and not go to insurrection, as bad or worse than 9/11, worst thing since the Civil War. And if you're forced to say it's either worst thing since the Civil War, worst thing since 9/11, or worse than 9/11, or you're a MAGA Trump supporter, then sometimes people will just feel like this pressure of saying, well, okay, then I guess it's an insurrection and Civil War. And the people that I think are fairly reasonable, like yourself, you would say, well, why are you forcing me to go into this box? And that's not the way a normal person operates. And especially when you see the hypocrisy, no, of course, no, this is not going to be called an insurrection. It's not going to really be covered, at least so far. It has not really been covered very much by the national media. I've seen some local reporters tweeting it out. And the hypocrisy couldn't be clearer. But I think most people live their life. I'm like a big fan of moderation in general. I think it's hard to do certain things moderately in moderation. Some things are, addictive, and you can't do that in moderation. But I think overall, that goes for thoughts too. And the way, like, intellectual moderation, like, I like, there are these buzzwords like, systemic racism. And it's like, I can see, there's systemic racism in places like, education or in housing, but is America systemically racist? That's kind of like going a little overboard. Like, let's talk moderately. Let's find intersectionality. It's like, okay, I can see why a Black man's experience would be different than a gay Black female woman, experience. Okay. Yeah. But that doesn't explain everything. And we can't just like now base our entire identity around that. So but we're so the polarized nature of this. And I do think it's not just the politics, but the performance that happens on social media leads these people to pull away from the moderate and normal side of this when that's really where most people, I think, are.
Yeah, the people we always joke on my little dumb show on YouTube, Dumpster Fire, that we're not a news show. We're like, we are not a news show. And people are like, yeah, but I get my news from you. I'm like, but we don't, just by the sake of covering the news, even though we cover the news the way the average person ingests the news, Maggie will read a headline and I'll be like, did anyone read the story? No one read the story. I'm like, here we are, America. We are the voice of the people. That's why we're like, we're not a news show, guys. Don't look to us to be like filtering what's right and wrong. Like you say in your book, people don't have time. They don't have time to do the due diligence. My husband and I were talking on our podcast about the way that he consumes media. He'll read a headline, and he's kind of trained me to do this, or see a video or hear a clip, and he'll notice right away, because he's a therapist. He kind of does an inventory, like, why do I want to believe this or not believe this? Oh, why do I want this to be true, or why do I want it not to be true? And then from there, he goes and looks at the source, all of the source material. If it's a study, he looks at who sponsored the study. I'm like, honey, who has time for this? Yeah. Because he's like, it's not because I'm some great person. It's because I have a lot of pride and I don't want to be wrong. I hate being wrong. He's like, I'm just vain. It's not like, oh, I'm this holier than thou news consumer. He just hates being wrong. So he says he'll do that work because he would hate to get something wrong. But it's almost always the case that when you do consume news like that, almost always the video is not what you thought it was. It's out of context. It's a clip that was taken from a quote that was only partial part of the quote. The study is dubious because it's sponsored by the people who are, making that product or whatever. But who has time for that?
I know.
This is what the journalists were supposed to do for the people.
Yeah, it was easier in the old days when you could rely on just a couple news sources. That's all that existed, and you had a level of trust in them, and they really felt a responsibility. Also, I think, to get the story right. There was less of the business side of it, and worrying about we used to talk about the 24-hour news cycle. I mean, that's completely gone. Now we've got with social media. I mean, this is just minutes, and these things are gone. I mean, I remember if I spend 2 days where I just don't open Twitter and then I go on there, I have no idea what anyone's talking about. I mean, it's like a whole other world. Everyone's moved on, and there's all these stories and in jokes, and I'm like, I don't know what anyone's talking about. And I'm also someone who kind of like your husband, like I'm very curious myself. I like to do the detective work and the exercise of oh, here's this thing. Well, what about what's this side saying, and where's the truth somewhere in between? I also I'm personally, my bias is I'm very apt to find the gray area, or if I'm around a bunch of people that think a certain way, I'm going to just automatically start arguing the other point. I feel like, and so
this is my husband.
Really? Okay. So it's a problem in some ways for me, but I also I really enjoy feeling intellectually uncomfortable. I kind of enjoy that, and the discourse, and watching really smart fights. I get off on that stuff. So I realize that most people are not like that. They've lives and families. They go outside, and they've got things to do, and they need a place to turn to and just get the news. And for lots of reasons, that doesn't happen. For lots of reasons, the way things get covered, especially complicated stories, where we really need the media to tell it to us in a concise, distilled way. Oftentimes, the most complicated stories are the ones that get covered the worst, because we have a media that's full of people that are fallible. Let's just be nice, but in some ways lazy and incompetent and not the best at their job.
Yeah, that was another chapter in your book that I really loved, the lazy and incompetent versus conspiracy theories. Right. And there's just, because there isn't this transparent, cohesive principle of just being a journalist anymore, and people are so skeptical, they leave things. The journalists do everyone a disservice by not covering certain things or labeling it disinformation or misinformation, because that's the easy way to just make it go away or make the other person who believes this seem like some whack job. It's like a vacuum, the people just, and conspiracy thrives in that. And you see this all over. Right now I'm seeing it after this shooting because they won't release the manifesto. I'm like, you aren't doing yourself any favors by not releasing this. The people have a right to know. And you would release every other freaking manifesto that ever comes down from a shooter, whether it's Christchurch and now you're going to not release this one and expect there not to be just thriving conspiracies around it. It's infuriating. It makes me mad because it's so unfair, and it's so destabilizing to just society in general. The very thin thread that's whatever is holding us together at the moment.
I know, and it's very transparent. I agree. I would say that if this was a white supremacist, in a MAGA hat that did it, we would see the manifesto at the very least. No,
it would be on the front page of the New York Times.
Right. I mean, at the very least, we would know what was in it and contained in it, and the motive behind it, and we would stop hearing we're just still searching for the motive. It's like, okay, well, there's a whole manifesto, so maybe that can give some clues as to what the motive might have been. Yeah,
It's like the definition of a manifesto.
Right. At the very least, we get that.
There's text messages like, I left enough information. They're like, we don't know what it is.
Right.
Well, you have a manifesto. We're still looking for some clue.
Yeah.
It is gaslighting.
Yeah.
It makes you feel insane.
And it's also like, I think it stems from a fundamental distrust of the public. Like we don't think you can handle this. So we're going to just make sure you don't see it. And I write, in the book, in one of the chapters early on about the temperature test, which is something I thought about really just in watching one of these ridiculous Trump stories that, came and went and was this giant, this is the thing that's going to take him down in 2018. And then of course that wasn't it. And then it was on to the next one. And I was thinking about this as like, okay, let's say you're in this foreign land and you go outside and then you come back inside and you're watching a news broadcast and you see the weatherman there and he says, he's about to say what the temperature is right exactly where you are. And but the sort of hypothetical that I lay out is, what temperature could he say? How far away from what you think the temperature is would you still trust him? And so like, let's say you think it's 72 and he says it's 68 or he says it's 76. Okay. That's fair. Like you're in a new place. You don't really know the exact temperature. If he says it's, 80 or, 60, maybe you still are kind of trusting him a little bit. But if he says that it's, 38 degrees out and you're like, is it Fahrenheit? Are we on the same? Yes, 38 degrees. And you're outside and you're like, no, it's definitely 72. And then all of a sudden, not only do you not trust this person, you're even more sure that it's exactly 72 degrees. And also
right.
This person is now lying about everything. Right. And now now you just don't trust them ever. And I think that's in some ways kind of what happened. It's that sometimes that the people on the TV, the supposed experts, will be right, will get the story right, but they have the trust has been so deteriorated. And because of that, people that believe certain things that are not true holds even firmer than they used to, because they've been spun so poorly in the recent past that they have actual real reason to say, I don't trust you. I'm going to just go by exactly what I think and not waver even a little bit.
Yeah, that was something that someone pointed out to me recently, that because of the polarization and the lack of trust, that is something I've just been obsessed with. What happens when there's this is it good that we don't trust the media? Michael Malice would say it's a white pill, that he says, good, we shouldn't trust them. We never should have. But I worry about people when they don't trust anything. And then I think, like you said, you're more inclined to revert to whatever tribal inclinations you have because you don't have anything else really to fall back on. And so people become more tribal and more polarized. And like you said, less willing to hear something that might make them intellectually uncomfortable.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I would say, so I would disagree with Michael in the sense that I think that in a perfect world, we have a media that's serving the public. We have a great, strong corporate media that's well-funded and is doing big things and speaking truth to power. And we have a thriving independent media also that's finding like niches and different audiences that way. And they're serving different needs and they're working together. That's my, glass half full, crazy optimist point of view. That's probably not going to ever happen. But but even let's just look at like the independent media structure. I'm someone who, I've got a Substack, I've got, a podcast, and I think of it as like Fourth Watch, where I have my newsletter. If I put something out there that I believe is true, but I know is going to lose me subscribers, is going to actually affect the bottom line. Am I going to moderate what I do based on the bottom line of the independent media structure? That's a very real thing too. And so I think it's hard to give your own audience the vegetables with the candy. But I also think that there are people, and I would probably count you in this for sure, of building an audience that are people that are intellectually flexible and are along for the ride. And I think that's what you want, and I do think that it takes a level of trust between the audience and the journalist or the creator and their audience to be able to go into those places and trust that these people are along for the ride. And it's a trust that even the people that are in the C-suites in New York City and DC at ABC and these other outlets have less and less trust in their own audience, I think. And it's very visible.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate. I see this from politicians too. It seems like, oh, we know it's best for you, little plebs. That became really apparent in COVID, particularly being in California. Just this sense that the people couldn't possibly know what's best for them. But I actually always think, and I say this all the time, reality remains undefeated. So if you like the insurrection as an example, if it was an insurrection truly, I think most people in America would be able to observe it and say, wow, that was an insurrection. They would view it and they would appropriately categorize it without being bullied into it. If COVID was as deadly as it was being portrayed, people were losing people left and right, and this was affecting healthy people and young people, and people would have been rightfully terrified of it, and you wouldn't have had to censor this information or feel like, oh, they're spreading disinformation by saying that sun is good for you. It seems to me that reality people are still going to get on board with what's real. And the pushback you're getting is often just when the media is trying to sell you something that's not real, and the population is like, fuck you. It's pretty simple actually, but then there's this disdain for the public, as if they don't know what's best for them, or what they can't trust their own eyes when they walk outside and they feel the temperature. Yeah.
A couple of things on that. First of all, like just January 6th example, this is one of a couple of topics that I really wish I spent more time on and uncovered, although it could probably be its own book, like the media coverage of January 6th. But I always remember the night of January 6th. So it happens at like 3:00, the riot. And then at 8:00 that night, I'm watching Anderson Cooper. And he's like mad, he has this whole thing where he's like, look at these people, they made a mess of the Capitol, and they're probably going home or they're going to the Olive Garden and to their Holiday Inn hotel and laughing about it. And I will say, because I actually went on Tucker the next night and was sort of making fun of it, like, oh, what do you have against the Olive Garden? I love the Olive Garden. But
I love the Olive Garden too.
Yeah, I mean, the breadsticks and the unlimited salad, it's great.
The salad dressing, come on.
It's really fantastic. And so it was very, elitist and smug, but it was a reaction that makes some level of sense. He was annoyed about it. They look at these people, they're making a mess of this place. Like, it's like, I get that. But he didn't
get poop on the walls.
Yeah, I mean, it was gross, and there are people, and then they got the feet up on the chairs. That's a normal reaction to what happened to this riot. But then he didn't get the memo yet that this was as bad as 9/11, and we can't be making fun of these people and saying that they're going. No, these people are terrorists, Anderson.
Right.
So days later, it evolved into it, but his instinct was kind of in the right place. I mean, it's honestly, I think about COVID too. Early on, we're talking February 2020, so before the whole lockdown, he's sitting there with Sanjay Gupta, like, because Trump had done the, we're not going to let people in from China whole thing. And he's like, I mean, come on, Sanjay, like the flu right now is worse than COVID, right? I mean, worse than the coronavirus. And Sanjay's like, yes, it is. But, COVID could get bad. The instincts in a lot of these cases are normal people. Anderson Cooper, I worked with him closely. He's a good guy, but then they get spun into this cycle of
frenzy.
Yes. And I think that's really obvious. And I have to say, I think one of the other big factors into this is the quote unquote experts. And this was so big with COVID, but also with all these political stories. The people that occupy green rooms, and who are the people that do their Zoom background and get the 10 to 10 by the Room Raider account on Twitter. These are not normal people. Like, these are people that are so divorced from the average American, and they don't have. I mean, I interact with people like talking about who has the wisdom. Who has wisdom in America? I think that there's a vast array of people that are not represented in the normal cable news yelling match. I mean, I hear, real wisdom from, a 25-year-old the HVAC guy who came to repair the unit that I talked to, the Uber driver. And those points of views, the messy, interesting, really smart points of views, are just not represented at all in the corporate press these days.
Yeah, that's something that I talked about a lot about this too. Just when I went on, it was my first media hit ever, and it was Ben Shapiro's 2018 election special. And I had never done media. I'm still not media trained, obviously. And I went on as an independent. He was very nice to put me on there and give me a media hit. I didn't know it was even called a media hit at the time.
Yeah.
And I went on, and I had family members calling me in tears. Like, how could you be on Fox News? And how could you do this? And Trump and all of this stuff. And as I had been in this media system in the Acela corridor going from DC to New York, and I started seeing that all of these people knew each other, would go on TV and fight and get off and be like, so see you at the barbecue this weekend. I'm like, they're all friends. Their kids go to school. They live in the same neighborhood. They're not dividing. They're happily dividing everybody, but they don't actually live that way. And so I couldn't really take it seriously. I always say this about rich people. I'm like, they're all hanging out. New York Times is with like the people from the right wing media. They don't care. The money people, they all hang out. They go skiing together. They chill. They're not.
No, 100%. It's always amazing to me. I lived in New York City for a long time, and you could walk from the headquarters of every major media outlet, NBC, CBS, NBC, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Within 90 minutes, you could hit all of the top places. I mean, Fox News is across the street from NBC. MSNBC. Yeah. I mean, they're literally across the street. That's where these things are, and it's also why I think the Trump era was so disruptive to the media ecosystem, because, I talk in the book to Tucker Carlson of Fox, who, Tucker I've known for a really long time. Back when he was at MSNBC, I knew him, and then he left into the Daily Caller, and he was in that DC media bubble for a very long time, and he describes like 2015 as he didn't know really Donald Trump. He's like, I just thought he was like some stupid reality show host, and I never watched NBC. I don't have a TV, but I was watching the fear in my neighbor, the fear that they had, the people that are like the elite in DC, of what this guy might do. And that really was an eye opener for me of something's here, something's different. And he said, ultimately, I left the city over it. He now is no longer in DC, never goes back there. But it also is like, I talked to Olivia Nuzzi of New York Magazine, who told me that, there was no social penalty when you went after the Trump or Trump administration. In fact, she says there was a social incentive. It would be good for your social life. Whereas with the Biden administration, there are people, it's not necessarily they're all best friends and they all hang out all the time, but there is a social penalty if you give a really, you write negatively about the Biden administration, there's potential for your social life to be disrupted by that. And that's just a fact of the way the reporting structure is now. That's the coziness. And that's something that you have to have balls to go and overcome and be willing to put yourself on the line. That's what journalists should do, but it takes something to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it seems to me that only goes in one direction. When I get accused of like, oh, Little Miss both sides, and, you want on both sides of this, and but which side is ostracizing their own people for pushing back? Well, there's maybe only one side that's doing that. I see it more on the right lately. I actually have to say that the wagons are circling on the right more than they have been previously. There seems to be some purity testing occurring, but it's definitely, that is a left-wing media phenomenon. That's not, I experienced that as in entertainment as somebody who comes from the left.
Oh yeah.
That wasn't, and that does say something to me about who's a little bit more authoritarian at the moment than than anyone else.
Yeah.
Even if I don't like to admit that.
Look,
I begrudgingly admit that.
Sure, yeah. I think, look, Joe Rogan is someone who, if he's going to be aligned with any candidate, is Bernie Sanders. Glenn Greenwald was very much like a Bernie guy, in 2015 and 20. I think about Glenn Greenwald because, this is someone who won a Pulitzer Prize at The Guardian. He uncovered the Snowden documents and, was an incredible journalist. A guy who was on MSNBC, Chris Hayes' show, like every night. I mean, he was in MSNBC primetime. And then the Trump era comes. And I don't think Glenn Greenwald has changed at all. I don't think Matt Taibbi or Barry Weiss or these people, they're essentially the same journalistic principles that they had before. But what's changed is the environment that they once occupied. The Guardians and the Rolling Stones and the New York Times have changed and appear to no longer have a place for them, which is crazy because these people are not now Trump supporters. They're not now have gotten, putting the red hat on, and I'm not, and you're not. But yeah, I think that there is a real authoritarianism when it comes to speech on the left and a real, under this guise of misinformation, a lot of actual information gets swept up and attempted to be dismissed in a very real way because I think of the lack of trust that the left and the corporate structure right now has for the general public.
I know, and then I wonder as we're sitting here talking, I'm thinking about my recent interview with Brad Palumbo, and he was saying, well, the media just gives the people what they want. So should they be trusted? There is this weird chicken and egg where they don't trust their audience to have any clue about what's going on. And I would say there's a general disdain for the masses. And there's, as my debate teacher always used to say, the masses are asses, which looking back was a very elitist thing to say. But it does feel like that. But then there is the sense, like you said, the incentives have changed. And I just got off a conversation about this very podcast and looking at the episodes that did best. And it's always the culture war people. And that was not really why I started this podcast. I started it to basically put stories of overcoming adversity and I just didn't want to be another podcast that talked about like, oh, the victim, I'm a victim or a victim. It becomes like this circle jerk. And those, culture warriors inevitably are the ones that do the most numbers because that's what people want. And I'm like, I don't want to throw more. Brad said it. He said, combat equals clicks.
Yeah.
That just is the average person independent or no? It seems like they want blood.
It's an interesting thought experiment because I think even if you have the culture warriors on here to get the Bridget Phetasy treatment, it's not going to be, you're not throwing red meat all across the board. You're going to get a different sort of side of things. And I do think though, there is a real appetite among the average person who may be independent, who may not be overly political on the right or the left, but that feel like they are, there's a level of fear and walking on eggshells and I can't say the things I actually think because I'm afraid of what might happen in my job, in my social circle, in my family. And so I do think that there is a sense of like the people that are willing to put their ass on the line and say things, consequences be damned, are really growing in power these days. And even to have the conversation, even for you to have conversations with all sorts of people. Again, I keep going back to Joe Rogan, but like that's important. Even Bill Maher, the fact that CNN is flailing, and I will say, they've got a new management in there, Chris Licht, who I know from way back, and I think his heart's in the right place. I think CNN's in a giant hole right now that they're trying to dig themselves out of when it comes to how they're perceived and the trust that they have. But I think that his philosophy is right. I think that we haven't really seen a lot of changes, but one of the weird changes that they've done so far is put Bill Maher on Friday nights at 11:30 by just airing the overtime that he's already doing. And what is Bill Maher? I mean, he's someone who is willing to say things that in a previous iteration, politically incorrect, to say things that could get him in trouble, could get him trending on Twitter. But he says, fuck it. Like, I'm going to say what I believe and what I think is true. And I think there's an appetite for that from an average person, even if they're not the kind of person that wants to go and fight in this culture war. They want to support people that are willing to have that conversation.
That's true. That's a good point. I mean, I see Glenn has his show and it's just growing and doing well. And what I found from asking people like yourself in the media, where do you get your news? And what I found is it's actually not organizations. It's usually individuals now. People find journalists that they like and somewhat trust. And even if they don't agree with everything, they know that they're doing their best to give them as straight a take as they can. Where do you, Steve, who wrote this very interesting book that everyone should get your news from?
Thank you. Yes. I wish there was an easy answer here. The truth is I get my news from the carefully curated Twitter feed that I've built for myself over years of a variety of sources, usually people, but some organizations that I trust, but don't take with full trust. I like to kind of get a nice variety in there. So I've built this thing together, and I get dozens of emails on a weekly basis from a variety of Substacks like yours and others. And so it's hard. It's hard to do. And I know that most people can't do that. So I think the key thing is, well, two things. First of all, I would say there are places like a Real Clear Politics, which I think does a good job of presenting in a very short amount of time a variety of points of view on topics that are interesting and important of the day. So I do like that, and I would suggest that that's one good place to go as like a quick snapshot. And then the other one is really just finding the individuals that are not always going to tell you exactly what you want to hear, because if you find someone you trust and they sometimes tell you things you don't like or even believe, that's probably a person that you want to continue to go back to.
I know Megyn Kelly. A lot of people have been going to her show and love it. And a lot of women in particular I hear from, because that's where they found me, was going on her show. And yeah, she has a lot of really amazing women who listen to her. And it's still a very male dominated field. People want to listen. They just like listening to men about stuff like this. They just do. I'm not trying to say it's like a victim thing. It just is the way it is. And that's not the case with her. She seems to transcend a lot of that, and also attracts a lot of women who are more independent, because they end up finding me, and they don't always even agree with her, but they still like her to listen to her so that they can kind of figure out where they might stand on an issue, because she is someone who takes such a strong stand. They can try and position themselves somewhere on the spectrum, because she's not afraid to plant a flag. Yeah. Unlike me, who's like, well, I can see it from here and I can see it from there. And I can, unfortunately, I try to see it from everybody's perspective, because that's just naturally how my brain operates. And it's sometimes I think, it's too confusing, like people don't know where to orient themselves against just like someone who's like, well, I can see it from all these sides. Yeah, although there's value to that too. I mean, the idea that they all suck is kind of like it's a relatable thing. I would say I probably tend to be more in your camp also. But no, that's very Gen X. That's Gen X of us, though. I think. Is
it? Well, I'm an old millennial, so I'll take it.
Yeah, you're like on the cusp.
I am. Yeah, exactly. Look, I think that I'm first of all, I'm really glad to hear that, because the interview you did with Megyn, it was probably like one of the first 20 interviews I think that we did on the show. This was in December 2020. It blew me away. I'm so glad that people went and found you from that, because it's still, I think, one of the best interviews I think Megyn did, and it was so great to have the two of you together and we love having you on. But Yeah, first of all, the stats wise, yes, we over-index women in a way that, the audience is much more female than the average news podcast or news video
Yes.
show, which is great, and we're happy with that. And the other thing I would just say is that, like, to your point about Megan, she is. First of all, I think I've written that she's like a media unicorn. Unicorn is like this term that NBA players use. There's like one Luka and one Giannis, and I don't know if you're an NBA fan, but they are singular. They are a totally unique presence. Unlike, there's no one like them, and that's really how I see Megan. But one of the things that she does that is extremely hard to do is that every conversation I've ever had with her off the air, when we were leading up to starting the podcast, or even just over the phone, it's exactly what she would say on the air. It's the presence that she is on the air is exactly who she is, and that goes in having a strong opinion in some cases, but really wanting it to be fact based, and really wanting to touch all the third rails and give the truth to the audience. I mean, I think of like what happened after the election in November 2020, when, unlike certain shows, we were like, let's look into all these lawsuits that the Trump administration or the Trump campaign is going into, and all of these, the different, this one is the voting machine, and this one, and we looked into all of it, and she concluded, no, this is not true. No, he lost, and saying that, and being comfortable with having certain portions of our audience being unhappy with that. But saying this is the truth, and being respectful about it, but doing so honestly, I think gives a lot of weight and a lot of respect that the audience has for her for that reason.
Yeah, it builds trust. You know that I trust. It's like even all famous people need to have two people that can still tell them the truth. I think you get up in these kind of echelons of just fame where everyone around you is like a sycophant, and they're just like, yeah. I think that it's good to have people that you listen to who don't necessarily tell you what you want to hear, even as an audience member. Like you said earlier, it's good. I love Glenn. I think he's an amazing journalist, that sometimes he'll say something and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that. And I don't know what perspective this is coming from, but I like that it makes me uncomfortable. Totally. I know, and I can trust that Glenn is not just shooting at the hip, and he too is somebody who is a journalist and a lawyer. And I think people with legal backgrounds too, they just have that tendency to want to know the facts and don't like being wrong.
Right.
And I can trust that there's some research going into what he's saying. Same with Megan.
Yeah.
And I think that's the silver lining, is that people are finding people that they trust, even if it's not someone they agree with all the time. That's becoming more important. Can you trust that this person is doing their due diligence and doing their best to get you accurate information, even while they give you their opinion and are open about their own biases? Because we all have biases. We can't get outside of that. And I think it's good that people are kind of transparent about those things now.
I do too. And I also think, like, to your point about this like intellectual discomfort, I just think it's so important. I think of like exercise, you work your muscles and you're sort of working them in the exact same way. You're making yourself physically uncomfortable as a way of building something in a positive way. I think the same way with our brains, and I never really told this story before, but when I was in college, a lot of this I think came from, I've had this philosophy for a while, but I kind of in high school I felt like I was a little bit of like a isolated upbringing. I grew up like upper middle class, to say, nice suburban upbringing. I went to college, and
Where are you from?
From New Jersey.
Okay.
Just like central Jersey. And I went to Syracuse University, and I wanted to, use that time in college, let's sort of expand my mind and my surroundings. And so I ended up taking a class in African-American history and then the next semester African American literature, and then became an African American studies minor. And so I started taking classes in it. And at the same time, there was a book that one of these like super right-wing guys wrote. It was like the 100 most dangerous professors in America. And they're all like the crazy left-wingers. And there was one that taught at Syracuse. And I'm like, okay, I got to take this class. Like that's exactly what I want. And so my senior year, it happened to be an African-American studies professor. He taught a class. It was sort of about rap music, but kind of about Lil' Kim, but it was an interesting class. Greg Thomas was his name. And it was unlike any other class I'd ever been in. It was, you'd go in the class, it was in like the humanities building. So it was set up like a normal class, but then you'd get there and you'd make a giant circle with your chairs. So there's like 50 of us. He was at the one end of the circle, everyone's staring at each other. And you would just basically talk. You would talk about what we had listened to or what we had read, what sort of assignments. It was really interesting. But I remember one moment where, we're talking about this was George Bush. And Katrina had just happened, and someone's sitting there talking about how George Bush is racist and how what he did in Katrina. And I remember like there was no one raised their hand. You just sort of started talking, and so I started going and talking about, well, how could he be? I can understand maybe you think some of his policies are racist, but he can't personally be racist. Look, he's got Condoleezza Rice in his administration, and he's got Colin Powell, and there was just laughter, essentially like chuckling, and I remember feeling like mad, like no one was even the students, other students, the teacher, no one was even giving me was even treating it nice enough to like respond why they disagreed, just like laughing at me. And then I went and I had like office hours with him the next day, and I said, it made me really uncomfortable. Like, I said this and everyone just started laughing. And he said, listen, I can't, affect what reaction people are going to get when you say things, but I want you to know that I want you to speak in this class. Like I want you to say exactly what you want, whatever you want. I support that. Like I want your opinion to be heard here. I want to have this conversation. Like I like having these sorts of conversations. And so I did, and I ended up getting an A in the class. It was a really great experience. There were some very uncomfortable moments, but it was a really good learning experience for me, because I feel like, you go through that, you're in situations that are uncomfortable, and you're out of that comfort zone. And intellectually, I think it's important. I know it takes work, especially now people are busy, but I really try to mimic that in my own life in a lot of ways whenever I can, because I just think you need that to even to feel more comfortable in the way you actually think yourself, to just get outside of it a little bit.
That's really hard. I don't think, I think that the human just automatic instinct is to avoid not being, it's to avoid discomfort and pain and feeling of like shame or embarrassment or being laughed at. That's not natural to run towards that. I think you have to be very conscious about it. Yeah.
We don't do it because it's easy or because we want it. And I also say, like, there's some level of privilege. I write about this in the intro of the book, like even just having these sorts of conversations and
definitely
being able to like, do this and talk about it and write a book like this, which is not, it's not the most important thing in the world. There's lots of people that are doing very important things, but I try to be self-aware enough to know that I'm given this, and I what I want to do with it is essentially empower other people to feel like they are, in some ways not alone in how they think about this. And I also try to say, look, this is what happened over these last 7 years, but here's why, here's how it came to be. Here's what to look for if it happens again in the future. And also, I really do, again, this is a bit, glass half full and just pie in the sky, but I hope that it spurs some change, because I think that the average person in this country is better off if we have a better press. And like, it's not just about tearing it down. Like, I really do think we need a strong media. We're not going to get one anytime soon, but if we can start to wake some people up, I think that would be beneficial to everybody.
How do you think that people, the average person listening to this, how can they help the situation?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think if in one way, if you're listening to this, you probably are at least a little bit more of a news consumer than even the average American, I would say. So
Yes,
first of all,
they're very online.
I would, yeah, right. I could say that. So one thing I would say is that it always bothers me when news organizations correct something, when they actually do, in the rare cases where they say, we made a mistake, we got this wrong, we've changed it to this. They should be applauded. I think that if we can applaud that good behavior, it can encourage them to have that behavior going forward. A lot of times, especially on the right, I see them then that leads to even more attacks. Laughing at them. Oh, you got this wrong. But if they're actually going to go and put themselves on the line to admit it, I think that that's something that should be encouraged. I think that's one thing to say. The other thing is, you can do it with your choices as well. If you, I'm just thinking of an example of this, like the New York Times. We've been critical of the New York Times in some cases here, but the New York Times does some good journalism for sure.
Yeah, and they do still a lot of good journalism.
Yeah, I mean, every day I think that there's good journalism being done that oftentimes is undermined by their own colleagues on social media in some ways.
What was the story that just came out recently that I thought was so great, and it didn't get any of the attention that it deserved, of course.
Right.
But it was about like the child labor that's happening by immigrants and all these businesses in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah,
that was a great journalism that the New York Times did. And this is, like you said earlier, these institutions that just have kind of shredded their credibility, when they do something good, now people won't even acknowledge it or pay attention to it because they're like, that's the corporate press, just being actually diligent and doing a really important piece about workers in the United States, but no one...
Yeah. And in fact, the New York Times did a story fairly recently. Actually, they've done a couple of these on the issues of, the alarming rise in trans girls in America. And they did it in a way that I think was pretty fair. I don't think that they were all in on the issue, but they were doing objective reporting on it. And they actually got, called out by these activists and internal by other staff members. Thousands of people signed this letter. Oh, this is anti-trans. And to their credit, unlike with the Tom Cotton op-ed, which I write about in Uncovered, they actually stood their ground and said, no, we're doing fair reporting about this. We've done a reporting on all sides of this. And also, you New York Times journalists, you can't sign letters like this because this is an activist letter and you're a journalist. So that's to be encouraged also, I think. And
right.
So there are, I think it's helpful to not broad sweep everything with the corporate media, with the New York Times, with CNN, and to highlight when there is good work being done, to sort of accept that in and say, okay, we'll not just immediately dismiss that because of it. And again, I think that when good work is encouraged, rises to the top, we don't just see the annoying people on Twitter, giving whatever the latest, activism masquerading as journalism. That's the thing that gets the clicks. If we can get the good journalism to bubble to the top, that will show the bosses that there's real financial incentive to them to do better work.
Yeah, but it's like, so we're fucked.
It's a tough one.
Pardon my language.
And subscribe to my Substack.
Yeah. So what you're telling me is we're screwed because it's something I even have to work against is just like the stuff with the train derailment. I was so obsessed with it. It wasn't being covered. It became politically inconvenient not to cover it. The media swarmed on it eventually. Biden went when, all the chemicals cleared out and it was safe. Everybody went and checked it out and then disappeared again. And we are in this cycle of current thingism, as they call it, where, like you said, if you go off for 2 days and come back on, you're like, what's the current thing? And who's the star of the day on the twitter.com? And the average person is not involved in that daily kind of drama and dopamine, but it's easy to get hooked on the battle. It is a bit like the virtual Coliseum where you watch these people duke it out. All of these platforms are incentivizing us to be more red-blooded. You know, we're like, we want to see the wars.
I know. And
I just don't know how you.
It's going to be harder, let's just say, over the next year, because the
we're
main
about
character
to go
syndrome,
into an election.
Yeah. Talking about main character syndrome, like the main character of all main characters is about to go take center stage once again. Donald Trump is, I would say
he's going to win.
Yes. I tweeted it out a couple of weeks ago. I think Donald Trump becomes president in 2024. I think that we're seeing the exact same playbook that we saw in 2015 and 2016 play out identically. The whole Joy Behar the other day was saying on The View, I want him to be the nominee because he's going to be easy to beat. It's like, this is exactly what you said in 2016. Are you not?
You guys learn nothing.
No.
Nothing. But they also kind of need him. He's like he is the carcass that they all feast off of. Totally. You know, I think somebody told me the other day that CNN gets 58,000 viewers. Something I'm not sure if that's accurate, but that is no wonder they hate Joe Rogan. He gets like 10 million downloads an episode.
Yeah, look, it's a little bit of apples and oranges only because it's the average number of viewers rather than the total. But yes, they are seeing record low ratings right now on CNN. 2022 was record low, worst ratings of all time on CNN and MSNBC. So it's a very dire situation for sure in the corporate.
But you know who will bring them back?
Of course, the savior,
great orange whale.
He is. I've described it as an addiction. I mean, I think that there's something almost like they can't even control it. The sadomasochistic relationship that they have with him. I mean, it is pleasure and pain, and they just love it. And I think we're gonna just see it all over again. So all of these bad instincts that the media has had that maybe they were trying to work themselves out of, we're just gonna go relive it all over again. It feels like it's sad to say, but I think that is going to be happening again over the next 12 months.
Do you think DeSantis is going to run, or do you think he'll wait?
It would be pretty smart of him to wait. I think if he runs, he's going to lose, and it'd be better to not get beat up by Trump and just wait. Maybe be the VP. It's only one term. I don't think he's going to run.
Yeah. You think he's going to run?
I do. Yeah. I think that he's got so many backers.
Momentum.
I mean, financially, and the support of like the new right ecosystem that really wants him to beat Trump. I think he's going to be running. I think it's going to be Trump and DeSantis left at the end, and I think Trump's going to win. But look, anything's possible. DeSantis he's got a great track record in Florida. He's got bipartisan appeal. The way he won Florida was shocking. I mean, winning counties that never would have gone for a Republican before. So I think that he's got the credentials to do it. Does he have the personality to do it? Especially when he's getting beat up by the guy who is, the host of The Apprentice. He's just The Apprentice.
I don't know. I feel like I'm not spiritually prepared for this. Even though I am. And I just always, because I was wrong. I thought for sure he'd win in 2020. I've been so wrong about so many things. I thought there would be a red wave. There wasn't a red wave. So perhaps I'm totally wrong about this. But I don't know who he's even running against. Biden?
Well, that's the other thing, right? Is it definitely going to be Biden on the other side? Because that seems very perilous for the Democrats. But what's on the bench? I don't know. I mean, is it going to be Kamala or Secretary Pete? I guess it could be Gavin
Secretary
Newsom.
Pete. Oh, God. Gavin, I will leave America if it's Gavin Newsom. I was saying it would be just my luck to finally get the fuck out of California, and then Gavin Newsom becomes president or some shit. I'd be like, damn it.
But look, you're in Texas
now, we
now,
all
right?
have to deal with them. We will be soon.
You will. Okay. So look, I think we're going to be fine either way.
This is the Alamo, though. Texas is like where the last free speech warriors are going to make their last stand.
That's true. We are here in Texas going to be fine, but in America, we are going to be fine. We did fine with Trump for 4 years. It was not nearly as bad as everyone thought it would be. Biden is not all there, but we're fine. I think we're all going to be fine. but from someone who's like from an outside perspective, don't have really a horse in the race at all. I wish that it wasn't going to be this circus like it was in 2015, 2016, but I truly think it is. It's going to be entertaining from that perspective, but
and we want
sad
it
from a different way.
We always joke what's bad for America is good for dumpster fire. Or like,
there's gonna be a lot of dumpster fires happening next year.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that I looked at when everybody was freaking out. And then I started, I joke a lot. Like I got sober in 2013 and then I got caught in the crossfire of the culture wars. And I was like, I'm a Republican? Like how much weed was I smoking? And it was just, it's funny because it is the culture just kind of moved and it was all of this craziness. And I do feel like we're going to relive that again. But one of the things when I started questioning, people were like, you're carrying water for fascists. And I knew nothing about media or nothing about right-wing media. I knew nothing. And the thing that I looked to was, are the agents dropping guys like Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck and Trump? Because if they are, I was going to be like, oh shit, maybe they are Nazis. Not that I was actually worried, but,
right, but
I felt like financially, if people were really concerned about this, like the agents would be kind of ditching all these people, and they weren't.
Right.
They all have the same agents. People who are online being like, I can't believe this person on the right. I'm like, you all have the same agency. And this is another area where I look. I'm always like, look to the money people. They're not dropping any of these guys.
Wow. So I think you're giving some nice fodder for the next activist push here is to like force the agents to drop the fascists. We'll see if they do. I can see the campaign happening right now. No, of course.
And you know what that means, Steve? You and I need to fill the void and start an agency right now for the right wing.
We'll be ready. We'll be ready for when it drops.
I'm going to be like astroturfing this and start this whole movement and then right. Pivot into like my agency. Be like, guess what, guys? Steve and I have an agency. We'd love to represent you.
This is a good business opportunity, I think, for us. This is
Well, what is I always ask the same two questions. This has been great. Please come back and it'll be great I can't wait until I'm a little more set up in Texas and I've just embraced that it's an election year and I want to start doing like panels with people like you and Wilford Riley and just have, more chatter because why not? I'm with you. I'm like, it's a privilege. I don't feel entitled to this job at all, even if I did kind of fall into it, like bum forward. I feel lucky to be able to do this and I don't take the audience for granted at all because every single person I know that their attention is spread so thin.
Definitely.
And I'm just so grateful that anyone pays attention at all to little old me.
Well, you're doing great. I love it. It's a great platform you built. So, I'm happy to do it anytime. And I'm glad to have you in Texas.
Yeah, we'll have to get dinner. What are your two biggest, what's your biggest defect of character?
I have trust issues in the sense that if someone says something, like if you said to me, hey, I have a question. Never mind. It would bother me for days. Like, what was the question? Why does she not trust me enough to ask me the question? It's weird that way.
That's also unsettling, though. That's like, hey, can we talk in text? And you're like, oh, what'd I do?
Yeah. And it's like, oh, I never.
I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
What's your biggest asset?
I think it's really that I'm think of myself as pretty open-minded and really game to talk with anyone about anything, and also try to keep myself having a decent level of self-awareness and self-criticism. You're just one of my favorite people, and I love this book. I hope everybody goes and finds it. Where can we find you and your book? Well, thank you, Bridget. I really appreciate it. You can find the book at readuncovered.com. Find me on Twitter, I guess, Steve Crack. Great. This has been so much fun, and I look forward to,
riding the insane. I feel like we're going to log out of here and it will be like, America's fine. And it's like the Tennessee Capitol has been taken over.
Yes, the insurrection. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget.
It's time for the weekly check-in with Bridget and cousin Maggie. I should probably record.
Probably.
I crack myself up.
I think that's a good thing. Everyone should be able to crack themselves up. How else would you entertain yourself?
It's true. Oh, and luckily my husband and I crack ourselves up too.
What were you telling me about today?
Oh, how we're probably on a watch list now.
Why?
Because we've been going down the domestic terrorism of the 90s rabbit hole. We were just talking about how wild it was to be. Gen X was trending the other night. We started talking about Gen X and just how much domestic terrorism there was in the 90s. And I had seen this Ruby Ridge documentary. And I think we were also talking about 2A and the Second Amendment.
Oh, okay.
Come on, Maggie.
I know it by the Second Amendment.
2A is the online street lingo.
Slang for it. You should know I wouldn't know that.
You spend a lot of time online, though. You watch more YouTube than I think most people do.
Well, I would highly doubt that because a lot of people just constantly watch YouTube
That's
now.
True.
But
More than me.
YouTube doesn't have all the. I mean, it depends on what you're watching, I guess. YouTube doesn't have I don't watch political videos on there or whatever, so I don't have the lingo down.
It's because we had Mike Jones on, future guests for those. Spoiler alert for those of you who are Grand Thumb fans, which I know there are quite a few in the fam because they are always posting videos from him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we were talking about, I think it was just all of these things. There was a long and winding conversation about Idaho and Ruby Ridge and how messed up that was. And then we watched, the new Waco documentary on Netflix, which was weird, weirdly felt like propaganda. It felt very sympathetic to the law enforcement in the situation more than I would have guessed. And there's definitely the guy who kind of famously took the picture on the rubble. Anyway, or the burned rubble.
Oh.
He's a freaking psychopath and comes off like one. But the FBI is completely inept. And so then we were rewatching the series about the Unabomber.
Mm-hmm.
And Jaron was like, my searches, because as we're watching it, we're like, is the Unabomber still alive? We just had all these questions. So he's like, my searches right now are Ruby Ridge, Waco, Oklahoma bombing. Because it's crazy. I didn't know the freaking guy from the Oklahoma City bombing was at Waco.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Selling merch and shit.
Jesus.
Yeah, he was radicalized by that.
Oh my God.
And by Ruby Ridge. And so he's like, he's like Ruby Ridge, the Unabomber. He's like, I'm definitely on some watch list. And the next day we walked out to go for a walk, and there was a kind of not their clothes too new to be. We were suspicious about this homeless person who seemed like they were just drunk, passed out with a big gulp right in front of our house.
Okay.
And Jaron's like, oh, there's a drunk homeless person sleeping on the curb. I'm like, or a fed. He's like, my searches right now. Yeah, no doubt. There is no doubt we're on some watch list. The Ruby Ridge story is so insanely fucked up.
I don't really know anything about it.
Every time I revisit it, I am just absolutely appalled at how fucked up it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
was that on the reservation?
No, this family they got paranoid and kind of. They became very God-fearing and a little bit not the rapture, but they were just like, oh, end times might be on the way. The government's coming. We need to go live on top of a hill in Idaho. And they kind of dropped out of society and went and lived on the top of a mountain in Idaho. And it was all for one sawed off shotgun or something, because it's like how he ended up on this kind of list is very suspect, but there's lots of Ku Klux Klan people up there. So he was kind of in the mix with there's a lot of
shady characters,
white nationalists. Yeah, Christian
people
nationalists.
who have their own militias. Yes.
People who are, and who are very distrustful of the government. And this family is one of those people. And it's like this weird, that's the same thing that kind of happened with Waco, where you see this very strange, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost that plays out.
Yeah.
Because the government is so fucking inept, they cannot help themselves. So Ruby Ridge, they start watching them, the family, and then they were like in the woods in all their gear, and they went out, the dog started barking, they went out to look, and they killed the dog and his son.
Oh my God.
They shot his son. So then they come back and there's 2 girls and the mother, and then later on they go to invade. They're still surveilling the kids, and nothing is really clear about what's happened. They're not letting the press know, because now the press is gathering, and now the locals are like, get the fuck out of here. And then they find out that the kid died, and then they killed the wife.
Oh my God.
It is the crazy. And the wife was in the cabin for a week while they were just holed up. It is the most fucked up story. It's such a fucked up story. Yeah, it's fucked up. There was 400 people from the army. They created a base or something. It's some ridiculous number of people for this family living on top of a hill. It was insane. And I was like, you know what? We just grew up with, and it's funny how much things had kind of immediately changed after that, because I think our generation, I remember Waco really well. I remember Ruby Ridge, and I feel like I always block it out of my mind immediately.
I don't remember Ruby Ridge at all. I remember Waco vaguely, and I remember the Oklahoma City bombing.
And the Oklahoma City bombing was huge.
And there was a bombing at the Twin Towers.
I can feel it. Wasn't that the song?
Was
that
it?
Was for,
oh God,
I don't know. I feel like that was the song that was. Maybe it wasn't. I feel like that was a song that was for the raising money for the survival. A lot of people died, and it was so many kids.
I know. There was a nursery there.
Yeah, it was under a freaking daycare.
There was a bombing at the Twin Towers, at a decade before 9/11.
93.
I remember that.
Yep. And I remember, and then the Unabomber was also terrorizing everyone.
I don't really remember paying much attention to the Unabomber.
I was really obsessed with the Unabomber when I was younger.
Of course. Let's cut that part out. No, but again, he had some good points.
I'm Ted-pilled. No, I was just fascinated with what a weird character he was.
Yeah.
And then it's just funny that in the documentary, they're like, you're not going to be like that guy who's kind of weird in the woods. I'm like, that's exactly the guy. Why would you be? Maybe we just know that now, but it seems like that's exactly the guy that would be doing this. The recluse. Mm-hmm. He was smart, though.
He was insanely smart. He was genius
level.
Yeah.
And so we were just talking about how it's weird not weird, almost by design. And then you had 9/11 and then Occupy Wall Street and all of these things that kind of galvanized the people and united the people. And they were like, oh, shit, this is not good. And they turned us all against each other. And here we are.
Yeah. For a while there, we were united against the rest of the world.
Yeah. But when you see all this stuff about it's just weird. It's just so weird. We live in really weird times. And I know everyone has I think that's true of kind of every generation, but the media and social media and the internet has amplified it so much that it's kind of impossible to, I don't know, step outside of it. It's the blob. You can't escape it anymore. Yeah, and I think there's just this anti-upping that is happening. Even just we see it with the kid stuff where I'm like, did kids always have cakes on their first birthday? And I was talking to my sister. She's like, well, some of my kids did, but she's like, no, but it's like an Instagram thing. It's like gender reveal parties. This goes back to my whole theory that Instagram has ruined the world. And then, we were kind of joking on the phone the other day where it's like, I was like, stop shooting up schools and cutting your freaking body parts off. Go get a tattoo and get some fucking piercings like we did.
That was our rebellion.
And then we were joking about,
how it's like anteed up for the last few generations. I was like,
our grandmothers were like, we're wearing pants.
And I was like, and our parents' generation, it was like, I'm going to grow my hair long.
And now they're like, what else am I going to do? Ridiculous. Yeah. And I guess there is a fair amount of domestic terrorism now. I think that's what all these kind of shootings are.
I know.
I was reading this whole theory that the new serial killer isn't sexual. It's attention. It's like getting attention with these mass shootings.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's why I'm so freaking enraged that they gave this last shooter so much attention.
Ugh. Well, and I was telling you this.
Well, not the last one, because there have been like two shootings since.
But I was telling you this because I watch like a lot of, like shows from different parts of the world. And like I love Korean dramas and stuff. They're so good.
Yeah.
And in one of them, there's a doctor in a hospital and she's working on a soldier and she's like, oh, were you shot? She noticed this scar and he's like, yeah, you've seen a gunshot? You've seen a gunshot wound? She was like, never in Korea, but I did some aid work in Africa. And I was like, I can't even comprehend what that looks like to not see a gunshot in a hospital in the United States or to have it be a rare thing, like a gunshot wound.
Yeah. Well, you'd have to leave America.
Yeah, exactly. We are so immersed in like we've grown up with it, and it's just always been part of this country. And the rest of the world looks at us and they're like, "What are you guys doing over there?" And I'm not anti-gun, but it's so strange that exists so much differently in the rest of the world.
Yeah,
it's just weird. And now it's like there's a shooting every day, or every couple of days.
South Park.
Now, what's this about? A failed math quiz, young man.
The only thing you could do is laugh about it.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, this is something Mike and I talked about. It's really hard. Like, how do you start policing people? How do you because I was talking about how I grew up in a house with someone who shouldn't be getting guns and had access to them. And how do you even start to really monitor that? Because do you trust that the people won't be like, well, being a conservative is a mental illness? Now you that seems like a very slippery slope too.
Considering the left's nonsense these days. And this is coming from a leftist.
Yes. We all know how you feel about JPB. Just kidding.
Oh, Lord. Let's not open that can of worms again. I was like, JPB. Completely blocked from my
2A, JPB. We abbreviate things online.
And your little internet slang.
Oh my God. If I read some of my chats from the very online people, you would be like, what the fuck are they talking about?
Well, and it's like Steve said in this episode, he was like, oh, if I'm off Twitter for 2 days and I go on, I have no idea what people are talking about. And that's how I feel all the time. Whenever I go check Twitter, I'm like, you guys, because no one references the story that they're talking about. They just assume that everyone knows.
It's true.
And so then people are making jokes, and then people are making jokes about the jokes. And it's just like, and I'm like, I don't even know what topic you guys are talking about.
What rabbit hole do I need to go down to even understand these jokes?
So I'm like, I don't have the energy to figure this out.
Yeah. I don't know. Twitter is so messed up. Maybe Elon knows what he's doing by inadvertently destroying it. Maybe it's part of his plan to just slowly destroy it.
You're giving him the 4D chess credit thing again.
I'd sooner give it to him than Trump.
True.
Elon's going to be in my life. He's going to be Matilda.
I better start backpedaling some of my anti-Elon
I feel like
rhetoric.
He can take it. He's going to be my daughter's godfather.
And Jaron will have no wish left in the world.
I need to insure her seats on that freaking rocket ship to Mars.
Biggest dream will have come true. Well, he's got enough kids. You could just engage her to one of his kids.
That's true. I've already arranged her marriage.
I know. I heard that. I heard that the other day. Jaron told me, and I was like, "Oh, so that's taken care of, huh?" He's like, "Yep."
We've got her protected and shored up. She is going to be like Hannah in the woods. If I can't get ready for the apocalypse, at least my daughter can.
Like, I'm just gonna set her up for her post-apocalyptic life.
I love Mike Jones so much. He is living the life of my dreams.
Yeah, it's the life we've always
really
tried to
is.
imagine ourselves living, like thought we could possibly make happen for ourselves.
It's not too late, Maggie.
Okay.
It's not too late. Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank our composer, Jared Elias, my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.